had been driving for hours down a rural highway close to sunset when my car suddenly broke down. I had no signal on my phone, and I was far from any town. My car started sputtering and eventually died completely. Now I was stuck on the side of the road, in the middle of nowhere. I tried restarting the engine a few times, but nothing happened. At this point, I was tired and frustrated. I got out, popped the hood, but I wasn't much of a mechanic, so I had no idea what to look for. Some smoke was rising from the engine, but that's all I saw. I didn't know what was wrong. I thought about walking to the nearest town, but I wasn't sure how far it was. Then I remembered passing a small road that led to a driveway a few miles back. I hoped there might be a house or someone who could help me down that road. I grabbed a flashlight from the trunk and started walking. As the sun set, the light quickly faded, and soon it was dark. When I reached the small drive, I found an old house hidden behind some trees. The place looked abandoned, peeling paint, broken windows, and an overgrown yard. I wasn't sure if anyone lived there, but I decided to check anyway. I knocked on the door, but there was no answer. The door was slightly open, so I knocked again and waited. Still nothing. Feeling desperate, I pushed the door open and stepped inside cautiously. The place was dark, musty, and the only light came from an old flickering lamp on a table. It felt strange, but I just wanted help with my car. As I stood there, I heard footsteps coming from the back of the house. I was nervous, but I called out, "Hello? Is anyone there?" My car broke down, and I need help. No one responded, and the footsteps stopped. At that moment, I decided to leave. The situation was getting too weird, and I realized I might be intruding. But when I turned to leave, I found the door shut. I hadn't heard it close, and when I tried to open it, it was locked. That's when I started to panic. I looked around for a way out, but the only window was too high to reach. As I frantically tried to unlock the door, I heard a low, raspy whisper from behind me. "What are you doing here?" I spun around, but no one was there. My heart raced, and I felt like I might faint. I kept trying the door, but it wouldn't budge. Then I heard the footsteps again, this time much closer. I turned slowly and saw a figure standing in the shadows. It was hard to make out any details, but it looked like a man. He moved closer, and I could see he was wearing a hood. I backed away, trying to stay calm, and said, "I'm sorry. I just needed help with my car." The man didn't respond. He just stood there, staring at me. My fear was growing by the second. I knew I had to do something before he got any closer. In a burst of desperation, I grabbed a heavy vase from the small table and threw it at him. It shattered, and the man hesitated for a moment. That was my chance. Somehow, I managed to force the door open and bolted outside. I didn't stop running until I reached the road. My car was still there, but it was getting darker, and I felt completely alone. I sat in my car, locked the doors, and waited for 3 long hours, hoping a car would pass by. Finally, I saw headlights approaching. I got out, waved my flashlight, and flagged the driver down. He was a kind man and offered to drive me to the next town. He dropped me off safely, and I finally had enough phone signal to call a tow truck. Looking back, I realized going into that house was a bad idea, especially uninvited. But I was panicking, and my broken-down car left me desperate for help. I just hope I never have to go through something like that again. One night, after a really long day, my car started acting up. It had been sputtering for a while, and then, without any warning, it just gave up. The engine died completely, and no matter how hard I tried, it wouldn't start again. I was stuck on a deserted stretch of road with no cell phone signal. It was late, probably around 11 p.m., and it was dark except for the moon and the occasional car passing by. I got out and tried to flag someone down, but the cars that passed didn't even slow down. After a few more failed attempts, I decided my best bet was to hitchhike to the nearest town, which was about 15 miles away. I started walking, hoping someone would pick me up. Finally, a beat-up old sedan pulled up beside me. The driver was a middle-aged man with a scruffy beard. I was hesitant, but desperate, so I told him what had happened and asked if he could give me a ride to town. He said he was heading that way, and I could come along. At first, the drive was okay. We chatted and had a friendly conversation. He talked about his own car troubles and mentioned a good mechanic in town. But something about him made me uneasy. Maybe it was the way he kept glancing at me in the rearview mirror, or the fact that he wasn't taking the most direct route. The conversation started getting more personal. He asked about my family, my plans, and kept probing about where I was going and why I was alone. I answered as vaguely as I could, and he seemed to be fishing for information. Then, about halfway through the ride, he suddenly turned onto a smaller road. It was dark, with no streetlights, and the road twisted through the woods. I started to get really anxious and told him that I appreciated the ride, but maybe I should just get out and walk if we were going off the main road. He laughed it off and said not to worry. I began to think about my options, realizing I might have to jump out if things got worse. Finally, the man pulled over, saying he needed to check something under the hood. I stayed in the car, but was ready to bolt if needed. I watched him through the window, and although he was fiddling around, his movements seemed oddly calm. I started to panic and decided I would make a run for it. Just as I was about to open the door, he got back inside and said it was just a minor issue and we could keep going. I nodded, trying to stay calm. We drove a little longer until we finally reached town. I thanked him and got out as quickly as I could, heading straight to the nearest gas station to call a tow truck. While waiting for help, I kept glancing around, still feeling uneasy. The tow truck driver seemed concerned when I told him what happened. He said he'd heard similar stories before, where people were led into the woods and then robbed, or worse. I had my car towed to the garage and spent the night at a nearby motel. I didn't get much sleep, and the whole experience felt very strange. Maybe I was overreacting because I'd never been in a situation like that before, but I couldn't stop thinking about how things could have turned out differently. If that ever happens again, I'll definitely be more cautious. This happened back in 2016 on a cold evening, just before it got dark. I was driving home from work on a quiet country road. My car was running fine, but the road was poorly lit, and not many people traveled that way. That's when I noticed a car up ahead on the side of the road with its hazard lights blinking. It looked like the car had been there for a while, so I pulled over to see if the driver needed help. A man was standing next to the car, pacing back and forth. When I rolled down my window, he came over. His clothes were a bit worn, and he looked like he hadn't slept in a while. He said something like, "Hey, thanks for stopping. My car died, and I don't have a phone. Can you help me out?" I agreed to take a look, and we walked over to his car. The hood was already up, but the engine was cold. I'm no mechanic, but I checked the basics. There didn't seem to be anything wrong that I could see. The man looked nervous, glancing at the dark woods around us. I offered to call a tow truck and pulled out my phone, but he quickly told me not to bother. He said he'd already called one, and it was on its way. I told him I could wait with him, making some small talk about whether he lived nearby. He didn't say much, just that he didn't live far. He seemed like he wasn't in the mood to chat, which I understood, given the situation. Since there wasn't much else to do, I decided I might as well clean my windshield while we waited. I grabbed a flashlight, Windex, and some paper towels from my car, but when I turned back around, the man was gone. I was confused. I walked over to his car to see if he had gotten inside, but he wasn't there. He had just disappeared. I shined my flashlight around, looking into the woods, but saw nothing. No sign of him at all. Feeling uneasy, I got back into my car. The man's car was still sitting there, abandoned. I called a tow service and told them what had happened, and they said they'd send someone out. As I drove home, I couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't right. Why would he leave his car like that when help was supposedly on the way? A few days later, I heard on the local news that a man matching his description had been reported missing. The authorities searched the area, but they found nothing. His car was still on the roadside, but there were no belongings or any clues as to where he'd gone. To this day, I have no idea what happened to him. Maybe he ran into the woods and got lost, or maybe something worse happened. It was definitely the strangest encounter I've ever had. One night when I was younger, my mom, Kate, and I had a really scary experience with a broken-down car. It was just the two of us at home that night, since my dad was working late. It was a windy fall evening, and I remember helping Kate make a late dinner around sunset. We were in the middle of chopping up vegetables when the front doorbell rang. I followed Kate to the door, and she told me to stay out of sight while she opened it a crack to see who was there. There was a man standing outside. He said he had a broken-down car and asked if Kate could help with jumper cables. Kate told me to stay inside while she put on her coat and went outside to help him. I watched from the window as Kate brought her car around and got everything set up. After a bit of work, they managed to get the stranger's car started. The man thanked Kate and drove off. It was getting pretty dark by then, so Kate came back inside, and we quickly got back to making dinner, hoping to have it ready before my dad got home. About half an hour later, the doorbell rang again. Kate was frustrated with the second interruption, but went to check who it was. I stayed in the kitchen, stirring the pot on the stove. Then, I heard a noise coming from the sliding glass door to my left. It sounded like someone was trying to open it, but it was locked. I set the stirring spoon down and went over to see what was going on. When I got closer to the door, I saw a man's face pressed against the glass. It scared me so much that I stepped back and screamed. It looked like the same man who Kate had helped earlier, wearing a blue jacket. Kate heard my scream and rushed back into the kitchen. She saw the man outside, now trying to force the sliding door open. We immediately called the police and my dad. My dad rushed home as soon as he heard. We went into another room to wait, but by the time anyone arrived, the man had already left. Dinner was forgotten, and we ended up ordering pizza. Kate told my dad and the police everything that happened, but we never saw that man again. I'll never forget the terror I felt when I saw his face against the glass. I was driving home late one night, taking the back roads like I usually did to avoid the traffic on the interstate. The night was quiet, and the road was narrow, with thick woods on both sides. It was the kind of road that always felt a bit eerie, especially when you were the only one driving on it. It must have been around midnight when suddenly I felt a jolt. My truck swerved slightly to the side. I quickly regained control, my heart racing a little, and pulled over to the side of the road. I got out of the truck, leaving the engine running to keep the headlights on, and walked around to the back. Sure enough, one of the rear tires was completely flat. Great, I muttered to myself, shaking my head. Luckily, I always kept a spare tire and a jack in the back, so I figured I'd just change the tire and be back on my way in no time. I grabbed the tools and the spare tire and got to work. The night was still, almost too still. It was one of those nights where everything seemed extra quiet, like the whole world was asleep. The only sound was the soft rustle of leaves in the woods and the occasional chirp of crickets. I told myself that I'd be back on the road soon, and there was nothing to worry about. As I worked, though, I started to hear something else. At first, I wasn't sure if I was imagining it or not. It was a steady, rhythmic thumping noise, like someone tapping on a drum in the distance. I stopped what I was doing and listened closely, but it stopped as soon as I paid attention to it. I figured it was just the woods making weird sounds and went back to changing the tire. But a minute later, the thumping started again. This time, it was louder and more persistent. The sound made me uneasy, but I tried to ignore it, focusing on my work. Then, I heard something even stranger. Whispers. Faint, almost inaudible whispers coming from the trees. I couldn't understand what they were saying, but just hearing them sent a shiver down my spine. I stood up straight, wiped my hands on my pants, and grabbed my flashlight from the truck. Shining it toward the woods, I scanned the trees, but all I could see was darkness beyond the edge of the light. The trees stood tall and still, like silent sentinels. The whispers continued, just loud enough for me to hear, but too quiet for me to make sense of them. The thumping noise grew louder, and my heart began to race. I hurried to finish changing the tire, not wanting to stay out there any longer than I had to. As I worked, the whispers and the thumping seemed to get closer, but I kept telling myself it was just my imagination playing tricks on me. Then I heard it, a low, guttural growl from the woods. It wasn't like any animal I'd ever heard before. It was deep, menacing, and close. Too close. My hands started to shake as I tightened the lug nuts on the tire, trying to work faster. I stood up and scanned the woods again with my flashlight, but there was nothing, just more trees and shadows. The growl came again, this time even closer, followed by the sound of twigs snapping underfoot, as if something was moving through the trees. I could feel the hair on the back of my neck standing up. My mind raced with thoughts of what could be lurking in the darkness, but I didn't want to stick around to find out. With my hands trembling, I quickly packed up my tools and threw them in the back of the truck. I just wanted to get out of there as fast as possible. I was almost done when, all of a sudden, everything went silent. The growling, the whispers, the thumping. It all stopped, just like that. I paused, listening for any sound, but there was nothing. The silence was so intense, it felt like the entire world had stopped moving. I felt a chill run down my spine. I didn't know if I should be relieved or more scared. I took one last glance at the woods, ready to jump into the truck and drive away. That's when I saw it, something moving between the trees. Out of the corner of my eye, I caught a shadow darting from one tree to the next. It was fast, too fast for me to see clearly, but I knew it was there. My heart pounded in my chest as I tried to make out what it was. It was too dark to see anything clearly, but whatever it was big. I didn't wait around to find out what it was. I jumped into the truck, slammed the door shut, and turned the key in the ignition. The engine roared to life, and I threw the truck into gear, my hands still shaking. As I pulled back onto the road, I kept glancing in the rearview mirror, half expecting to see something chasing me. I sped down the road, trying to put as much distance as possible between me and whatever was back there in the woods. My heart was racing the entire drive home, and I couldn't stop thinking about what had just happened. The whispers, the growls, the shadow, it was like something out of a nightmare. I didn't stop until I was safely back in my driveway, and even then, I sat in the truck for a minute, trying to calm down. It's been years since that night, but I still think about it sometimes. I've driven those back roads since then, but nothing like that ever happened again. I don't know what was out there in the woods that night, but whatever it was real. I'll never forget the sound of those whispers, or the sight of that shadow darting between the trees. Sometimes, late at night, when I'm driving alone, I still feel like something is watching me from the woods, just waiting to make its move.